Welcome, everybody. Get started on our next panel, which is the Cybersecurity Risk Analysis, Planning, and Implementation. And my name is Mick Davis, and I'll be the moderator for this panel. And this is where the rubber's going to start meeting the road. My background is I worked in the Department of Defense and the intelligence community as a risk assessment planner and senior advisor. I'll start off with our first question and get our panelists to introduce themselves. What do you see as the greatest cyber threats to your business operations?
I'm sorry, we're having a little bit of trouble hearing. If y'all wouldn't mind speaking into that mic,
Okay.
to the extent that you can, so gently pass it.
Just slide it across.
Thank you.
Okay. So do you want to go down the line?
Whatever you prefer.
And
I'll start if you
would
want.
it be helpful for us to introduce ourselves?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So my name is Christopher Leitz, or you can call me Chris. I represent a company called Coalfire Systems. We're a 15-year-old company that's been in the cyber risk management and audit compliance business for the entirety of its organization. I come to you speaking from the background of a 30-year technology career. I guess the first 10 years of that I spent building systems, worked with them for Accenture and a variety of industries. After that, I got involved with big data and analytics through FICO, a company that was built here in Boulder and subsequently acquired by FICO. So I guess we built systems and we use systems for analytics and data. And now I'm in the securing those systems and securing that which we have wrought over the years of all of that. As I said, my company is, we have the question that Mick asked was about what is my company's greatest cyber operations. I think I'm going to twist that and answer it in the context of my clients. My company gets to serve 1,500 clients nationally. We have offices around the country and to some degrees internationally. And our role is that of typically an auditor or boardroom advisor. Our clients are the chief information security officer, perhaps the audit committee of the board that is asking questions about, well, they're asking me those very questions. What are the greatest risks that we must manage and be under control? And I think I'll start by answering the question of thankfully they're asking that question and they're moving beyond the compliance question because as we all know as citizens and practitioners, that was kind of a baseline expectation in various industries and government public policy mandates and just risk management industries of, say, the credit card industry enforced and cascaded a series of compliance requirements across industries, and that was prevalent in banking, of course, and retail and whatnot. And while that, I think there's a growing awareness among leadership teams that that's a baseline level of security. Fine, we're happy to have that, but now there's this whole threat landscape that needs to be addressed. And I guess the comment I'd make is that I think the greatest threat is the soft target nature of the workforce and just the oversharing world that workforces and enterprises, as they do business to business and work across third parties, play. I mean, most companies probably struggle to recognize what information they have, where it is deployed and shared with, what the classification schemes that govern it and that are obligated to enforce and adopt and control. Companies have shared information with cloud service providers, thousands of vendors, and that information is just out there. And getting it under control and maintaining some modicum of security protocols is, I think, the way I'd answer your question, Nick.
Awesome.
My name is Mike Glenn. I work at Cable Labs, which is a nonprofit research and development company for the cable industry globally. We have members globally. And I run the member-facing security program for Cable Labs. Prior to that, I spent almost 15 years at Quest and CenturyLink working on their backbone and service delivery networks, their hosting environments, their enterprise security program. I was the CISO of Quest, and then working on some federal government programs around cybersecurity. From the biggest threats that we're seeing, I think you kind of need to break it up, from my perspective, into short-term and long-term. So in the short term, you see kind of these acute problems. DDoS attacks are still, prevalent in the industry and cause problems and issues, although we have significant technologies to help address that, but they continue to flare up. In the long term, my concern is around a couple areas. One is around IoT, and the communication companies have a history of understanding and having to clean up botnets and bot-infected devices, and that's just going to continue to get worse, and that problem is going to grow, right? And so I'm concerned about IoT and the requirements or the security around IoT vendors and what they put out in the marketplace, that eventually the ISPs may be expected to have to deal with, even though it's purely a cost burden on them. The second area in the long term that I get concerned with from communication networks are destructive cyber attacks. And that's, a rising concern. We've seen several examples of those, and I think that's going to grow as our adversaries get additional capabilities and expertise, especially organizations that don't have red lines.
Thanks, Mike. I'm Jeff Goldthorpe. I'm Associate Bureau Chief for Cybersecurity and Communications Reliability at the FCC. And I've been basically in a job very much like that at the FCC since 2001. And before that, I was at Telcordia, where I was general manager for a consulting practice on broadband access technologies. So I'm an engineer, and I've been doing work like this for the last 15 years or so. Now, first I love the comment, Mike, you made about IoT. And one of the things that worries me about IoT is I don't know how you build security features into devices that are going to sell for almost nothing. How do you secure a network of devices of nothings, basically? I don't know, and that answer hopefully will come, but I don't know what it is right now. There's two other things I wanted to mention to answer this question of what are I think the biggest threats facing the sector, and I will answer on behalf from the point of view of the sector as a whole. One is from the perspective of cyber risk management. We have a sector that's extremely varied. It's already been mentioned here that we've got very, very small service providers in the broadcast segment and in other segments as well, not just broadcast, and that may not have the means or the affordability to have the sophistication that a much larger entity would. But we also happen to be in a sector that is interconnected. These entities are all interconnected, so risk moves. It doesn't stay within one entity. It moves around. So we truly are as weak as our weakest link. And that's a threat, a concern that I think we have to accept the fact that that's going to be the nature of the sector in terms of the variability. But there needs to be some way to ensure that there's some level of cyber risk management that is carried out across the sector. Now, the last area is one that I've been talking about for some time, and that is there are sort of fundamental vulnerabilities that have been baked into the Internet since the day it was born. And it wasn't... The Internet was not born in the commercial sector. It was born basically in the academic sector. And the people that were building it didn't assume that it would be attacked. They didn't build security features into the protocols that run the Internet today. So the protocols that are used for interdomain routing to move packets amongst different domains on the network, different networks on the network, there's not security built into those protocols to make sure that packets aren't routed on in ways that they weren't intended. There's not security built into the domain name system that's used to get you to the website, for example, that you might want to get to. And so these kinds of things have been around for years. They're sort of the hard problems on the internet. They're not cheap to fix. They're going to take a while to fix. And we're working on it. Industry has been working on it. Folks have been working on this for years. But I didn't want to let this question pass without bringing it up. Chris?
Sure.
Oh,
Is it on?
that would have helped. Could you all hear that?
Could you do that one more time?
Say that again.
Sounds like it's working now. I was clicking on it, so I made sure, right? So in terms of threats, I don't think there's like one greatest threat that we have to deal with. There's a multitude of threats that we have to be prepared to deal with. And that kind of goes back to what Chris was saying earlier. You know, I was just looking at a report over the weekend. The SANS Institute did a survey of systems administrators for SCADA systems, or industrial control systems. And some of the sysadmins had come back and said some of their greatest concerns were things like destructive malware or insider threats. So I think there's also social engineering concerns. So there's a whole range of different concerns out there. But I do think a lot of it comes with the soft targets. It does come from the end user being infected. And I think when you think about security, one of the things, at least at AT&T, that we've been really focused on is this whole concept of shifting away from a perimeter-based defense. I think that's why when you talk about security these days, a lot of the focus is on incident response, not on actually building out the perimeter. And from my perspective, there is no such thing as a perimeter anymore. It's completely gone away. So as you have more and more users who are trying to connect, like let's say, for example, you have your own corporate network, and you have VPN connections coming in, you have vendors coming in, you have customers coming in, you have so many different connections coming into your systems that there's no such thing as really a security perimeter anymore. So the whole concept of building up a big wall, it's kind of like the Maginot Line was for France. They just fly right over to go around it. So it becomes an issue of, how do we build better security with the understanding that people are going to get in at some point. They are going to try to get in as best as they possibly can, leveraging these social engineering tools. And at least for our company, what we focus a lot on recently is on this whole concept of virtualized security. And that basically is the idea of, instead of having a big firewall that prevents people from getting into your systems entirely, you have different instances of data that are stored in the cloud, and then you put virtual wrappers around those instances and put security around each instance of data so that if somebody gets into one system, they may not be able to get to another system because you can quarantine and box off that particular segment where they've gotten access and more quickly respond. So a lot of this gets to, I think the Admiral earlier was talking about it, kind of architectural changes. I mean, these are the types of things that we think over the next several years are going to be necessary to really build out a better security system. So the threats are pretty varied. It's hard to protect against all of them, and so in the long term, I think migrating security architectures, or actually computing architectures, is probably going to be the way to really enhance security in the long term.
Awesome. Awesome. So that's our panel. Some pretty smart people. One of the cool things about being a moderator is I get to inject now and then. And I came home from I was deployed to Fort Meade and working at U.S. Cyber Command, and I got sent to the risk assessment group, which is basically sort of like here. How are we defining risk? And I brought up a really obvious question. How do we define success? And if you clearly define success, then you can start to deconstruct what you need to do to get there. So this question is, beyond protecting the flow of data and communications, the underlying infrastructure is built on legacy infrastructure. What should be done for physical security and protecting legacy systems? Chris?
Okay. I'll try to provide a comment related to a story. I have as I said earlier, my company is privileged to get to serve a variety of clients, so we get a few case studies and war stories to tell. I'll tell one that's related to a legacy system, and it really comes down to I guess the long and short of it is the business owners and the process owners I think are critical in the protecting of the legacy systems, which may sound a little bit counterintuitive, but let me explain it this way. We had a client that was compliance focused and had a well built out and seemingly mature security program. But then they asked us a pivotal question. They said, we're an insurance company and we have all of these controls, but could you steal our money? And it was interesting. The question wasn't at all technical. It was rooted in their trading desk and their trading systems, and could you gain access to that and steal our money? And so what they were asking a legacy system context. It was a well-established 20-year-old system, and what we learned, and yes, we could steal their money. It was not all that difficult for our testers to hop on the network, move laterally, escalate privileges, and then gain access to the credentials necessary to log on to not only the trade desk system, but a third-party trading system as well. And so there we were with our testers, had their little screen cap of being able to, I could have hit this button and moved money. and it was a very interesting story, but what could they do? It was clearly a separation of duties function. It was do you have a control that would have stopped this? Do you have a defense in depth and layers of controls that would have been in place to back up the technical controls that were obviously soft? So I guess my answer to that is legacy controls, separation of duties, defense in depth.
Awesome.
So when you talk about legacy systems, all companies are faced with that. And, in the communications sector, the kind of a typical example is the PSTN system. And what you see is these large, very expensive legacy switches that are out there, right? Class 4, Class 5 switches that are very, very fragile, right, when you look at them. And so, some of the typical things in the past that companies have done, right, is to build protections around those very fragile systems, to add in modern security protections around those systems. And so you put in individual accounts, right? Many of these systems you can't even have individual accounts for individual accountability. You provide firewall capabilities to limit who can get in, provide two-factor authentication within those systems, full auditing and logging capabilities and those type of things. But I think the key is you have multiple layers of defense around these legacy systems, that what you have to do is you have to build and protect those systems until you have a chance to replace those and upgrade those systems. In addition, you will always have this problem where you have legacy systems, whether, for example, transport systems. When you look at transport and optical systems, for example, you had these systems that used to be manually configured, and you have to have a technician come in and put a specific laser in for a particular wavelength on these systems that carry huge amounts of data. Now we have ROADMs, that are remotely managed, but they haven't necessarily been exposed to the particular attacks that other equipment has had. And so we're always in a catch-up game around that. And so the other factor I think that you have to think about in this is since we're here at an FCC event, is thinking about the ability to replace legacy systems and not be encumbered by having to support these legacy systems. Because when you think about, for example, the PSTN network, and the FCC has done this, right? So I'm not saying that they haven't done this, but the ability to change out those systems to more modern systems, more modern protocols. Because in the PSTN, we're getting to the point where you have to buy parts off the gray market, right? You have no other choice. And so what types of vulnerabilities, what types of issues does that introduce to the system, right? Yeah. It's a difficult problem to deal with, and one we'll always have.
Hey, thanks, Mike. Yeah, I know one of the things that it does, and we can see it in the outage reporting data that we get, is that it increases the length of time it takes to fix outages. So it takes a long time to get spare parts, right? So, and we measure that and we've observed it. So the good news is the news that's already been stated, and that is these systems are legacy. They will transition out. They have very long tails. They'll be in the network for a long time, right? The thing that makes them vulnerable is the aspect that is that they kind of have a crunchy exterior, and they've got a soft, chewy interior, right? They weren't built with, right? I mean, they weren't built with a lot of security baked into the part that people want to get to. They were built with security on the outside so that, it would be hard to get to the good stuff. Well, once you get there, you're there. And Mike described some things that you can do to make it more difficult, even if you breach the outer defenses, to kind of exploit what you're trying to get to. And that's what has to be done to make these systems less vulnerable while they remain in the network. But it's true, they are being transitioned out, and the FCC has taken steps to move that along. We understand that is what's happening. So, I would just end there and say, that we're doing the right things.
Yeah, I think when you start talking about legacy systems, it's really just applying security principles that we already know to the same sets of systems, right? So it kind of goes back to the comment earlier about defense in depth, or what Mike was talking about with segmenting off the network. I mean, these are things that we've known and done for a long time. I mean, I know at AT&T that we hardened our network, which basically means we put in a bunch of techniques and different policies to ensure that there's not a bleed over of traffic. So, for example, we separate off our operational support systems from our core traffic on the network itself. So through things like network separation, traffic separation, these aren't new things, right? I mean, these are security principles that have been out there for years. I mean, if you go look at different frameworks like ISO 27001 or SAS 70 or any of the other major security standards and frameworks, they all talk about these different things. So when you talk about whether it's new systems or legacy systems, it's really just about applying a lot of the principles that we already talk about. I was looking at at another report. I think the Department of Energy, I believe, did a session on like 21 different steps to secure SCADA systems, or again, industrial control systems. And the last stuff they had in there was the same sets of principles: network separations, firewalls, access controls. These are all things that we do today and we've known about for a long time. So I think it's the same practice of trying to ensure that, as a company, that you have those types of controls in place to protect your systems. Is effectively what needs to be done and what should be done. I think a lot of the big carriers, at least in my experience, working with them quite closely as part of the Sector Coordinating Council and other entities, I think it is something that that the industry is doing very well on today.
Awesome. It's awesome. Next question was, what frameworks can be used for assessment, planning, and monitoring? And sort of a follow-up that where can these be improved? I have an opinion. I'll save it for last.
Okay. Well, I'll start out again as the assessor firm. That's what we do. We do assessments. I was appreciative of the shout out in the last panel group about the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. I think that's becoming kind of a cross-industry standard, since it's one standard to unify them all to some degree. So I think that's a perfectly adequate and acceptable standard. And yet, what I think I've just misspoke. It's not really a standard. It's a framework, right? It's a capability, and I think what organizations are going to have to do business with is wrestle with the data that sits behind that. We're in the business, of course, of providing adequacy tests, but what we still render auditor opinions, and we still render best practices opinions, and those are fundamentally judgment-based. So there's ultimately a risk there's a lack of data in the risk management vector, if you would, that'll provide more solid grounds for companies to stand on. And so I think boards are really wrestling with it. The question that we get from the commercial sector, and I think elected officials as well, is they say, well, how good is good enough? What is expected of me for managing this particular risk? How do I know when I'm there? And of course, we all know that this is going to be something we're all working on, and our industry is going to be working on for a long time. But I think the cybersecurity frameworks and the industry organizations and SANS Institute and all the other people that are putting education and policy and frameworks out there need to come alongside and provide data and peer comparison. And I think we'll continue to talk about that through the course of today.
I'm going to change it up a little bit and throw the mic down here to I don't care.
All right, I'll do it. I'm going to end up with
But
a
I will
sooner or
come
later.
back.
All right, that's cool. All right.
Okay, perfect.
I will give a big, huge shout out to the NIST Cybersecurity Framework at the FCC. We asked the CISRIC, that's already been mentioned. It's an advisory committee that we charter. We've been doing it since for years now, since I think it's '92, but I could be mistaken. But more recently, we've been getting into cybersecurity. And when the NIST Cybersecurity Framework was released, it didn't take us more than a couple months to ask CISRIC to take the framework, which is agnostic to sector. It was not designed for the communications sector. We asked the CISRIC to come back with recommendations on how the framework could be applied in the communications sector by the different segments, the broadcast segment, the wireline, the wireless, and so forth. The CISRIC, the advisory committee, formed a working group of 100 practitioners, a big working group, with members from all those segments, and came back with recommendations last March. And that was the 300-page report. It might be 400. Vern, what is it,
415.
All right. I'm going to say 400, okay.
Nice
It's a
precision.
big report, okay. Now, you don't have to read the whole thing. If you're in the broadcast segment, you might be better off just reading the broadcast portion of the report. But the point is, the work takes a view of cybersecurity that's different than things we've done in the past. In the past, we were sort of orthogonal. We were looking at particular issues like DDoS attacks and like routing security and like naming security, So that's sort of orthogonal to the concept of cyber risk management, which is more, it kind of goes across the organization. And so the recommendations came back in that manner to promote the use of cyber risk management capabilities within an enterprise. We are now about ready to start a process which was recommended to us by CISRIC to meet face-to-face with communications providers and learn what processes they use to manage risk. And that should give us a lot of visibility. It's not data, and we don't intend for it to be data. We intend for it to be a dialogue with companies and a voluntary dialogue. Nobody has to come talk to us. But this was a recommendation that the industry gave to us, so we expect that folks will be willing to come and speak to us, and we're looking forward to it. So, I don't know if I answered your question, but I tried.
Perfect.
In terms of frameworks, I don't want to be redundant, but the obvious one is the NIST framework. But I'll just add to the comments that were made previously that there are a range of different security standards that are out there today, and the NIST framework is effectively just an accumulation of those. So if you look at the NIST framework, it divides it into 5 different segments, right? It talks about protect, detect, identify. I forget off the top of my head what the other 2 are, but basically, and then it has a section of cross-references to other standards that are already out there. So it's building off the building blocks of the NIST framework are really things like the ISO standards, the PCI DSS standards, the NIST 853, which was the set of standards targeted at government agencies under FISMA. So it's building off of other different building blocks that are already out there today. And a lot of those frameworks are already in widespread use. A lot of different companies are already certifying against ISO 27001. They certify for HIPAA compliance. They certify for FISMA compliance. So there's a lot of different standards that are already out there today, and this just kind of builds on that. And I think that in terms of the reason the NIST framework has been so widely accepted and works so well is it really is more about risk management than dictating the standards to you. So that the process of the NIST framework is to look at your core mission of your business, determine what are the core functions that you do. Look at the risks to that, and then pull from these different I like to call it like a Chinese menu. Look at these different standards that are already out there today, pull from those, and build a risk management program to best mitigate the risk. So it builds in an aspect of flexibility, and it ties back to what are the different assets that you own, what are the different things that you do, what are the risks to that, and really building a program around that. So if you're just offering something that is of minor consequence, maybe the program, maybe the standards you employ are going to be quite a bit less. If you're someone who runs like a nuclear power plant or has there's a significant risk that's out there, maybe there's a more stringent controls are required. And kind of tying back to the IoT comments that were made earlier, one of the things that I have the privilege of doing at AT&T is I'm the point of contact for AT&T on the National Security Telecommunications Advisory Council. the Instack, which is one of my CEOs is AT&T's Instack member, and I staff him for those meetings. And one of the reports that we did last year was on IoT security. And that's kind of what we talked about there, was making a bunch of different recommendations about how to deal with IoT security. But the concept embedded there was the threat correlates back to the function of the device. So you have a spectrum where if a device is more, if you're talking about nuclear power plants and those types of things, it's a much higher degree of risk or a higher degree of impact, right? So the impact and the risk is what kind of calculates the level of the controls that are necessary. And it's something that I know the industry is actively working towards, and hopefully we'll see more movement in that direction over the next several months to a couple of years.
Well, to add on some of the comments, the NIST Cybersecurity Framework really was an excellent framework, right, that pulled together all of these different concepts and really focused it on that risk management concept. And one of the key things in my mind that it provides is the ability to profile from a risk management perspective different industries, so you can better invest your resources, your limited resources, where they're most effective, right? And so that profiling, that flexibility, I think, is one of the key things around the NIST cybersecurity framework from a risk management perspective. But I think, as a practitioner, I think the framework many times is kind of less important than your overall assessment of your program and your threats. And I'll tell a couple stories here just to bring that home. When I was working before at Quest, the former CISO, before I took over, had the viewpoint, and rightly so at that time, that where we should focus on is minimizing the vulnerabilities and not focus on the threat side of the risk equation, right? Because if you can drive either one of those to zero, right, your risk is zero, right? You have threat times vulnerability times consequence. And her philosophy was drive vulnerabilities to zero, right, and not have to worry about the threats. And what we've seen since that time became very clear. You can't drive vulnerabilities to zero, right? You just cannot do it, right? And so you have to look at your threats that are coming at you. You have to understand the threats in order to allocate your resources properly for where those might go, and look at the systems that you're trying to protect. It's a classic case in the government. You don't classify everything in the classified sense top secret or secret, because if you classify everything as top secret and try to protect everything, you're protecting nothing, right? And so if you try to do that in information security, you have the same problem. So you have to allocate those resources. And part of the problem with some of the standards, I'll finish up with a story around PCI. So PCI, in my mind, is a pretty good standard to do that, but it has to be applied in the right context. So I remember I've leveraged PCI to help drive good security practices. So when I had to drive some security practices in a hosting organization, right, I got all of this pushback that we can't implement pen testing, we can't implement vulnerability scanning, it could cause outages on the network, it could cause impacts on revenue, all of this. And I leveraged PCI in order to say, look, it says you must do this to be PCI compliant, right? And it forced their hand in order to supply the products and services that they wanted to. So that was a good thing from that perspective. On the other hand, I had a PCI auditor come in, and if you know anything about PCI, one of the big requirements on PCI is around scanning for rogue wireless access points. There's a very good reason for that, right? That's how TJ Maxx got compromised. Someone parked in front of one of their stores, right? I think it was in Florida. They'd had poor wireless security. They got access to the store network, and then they went upstream and stole, eventually breached their credit card systems, payment systems, and stole huge amounts of data. But I had an auditor come in and said, well, you've got to scan for rogue access points all of your POPs. I went, are you out of your mind? Well, it's a PCI requirement. It says so right here. Yeah. I said, that is just asinine, right? I will give you access to my lab. I'll could you come in and show me how you could steal data off of an OC48 with a rogue wireless access point or off of a 10 gig Ethernet, right? If you can show me that, I am glad to start scanning for rogue access points, right, in my POPs. Otherwise, I think this is a waste of resources. And then after that, he gave me an exception to that particular requirement on PCI, right? But it's an example of you have to be careful where you apply different standards, and it has to make sense to the threat that you're trying to address.
Well said.
Perfect story, Mike. The one of the things, part of the question was where can these be improved, and everybody talked about NIST, and nobody mentioned ISO, but or as you know, when I was a young man, Octave at Carnegie Mellon. So it all is really about how you characterize your problem and how you're using measures and metrics to validate your assessment in a standardized way. And so I think there's lots of room for improvement because I think storytelling helps people understand. I know when I talk about NIST, people start to glaze over really quick, and from an executive level, if they glaze over, you're not being effective in your message. Next question was, as part of risk management preparation, what is your incident response plan? How do you capture data, keep secure, and work with public law enforcement? You guys want to start?
Okay.
Change it up.
I think this is one that we were gonna not go in order.
Well, oh, sure.
Yeah.
Well, I'll start on this one then.
All right. Okay.
So again, my experience has been that kind of the major change within information security programs over the last 5+ years, right, is the recognition that you have to realize management understands now that you can't protect everything. You will have incidents, and organizations have increased dramatically the number of threat responders, the type of monitoring they're doing on their networks, realizing the fact that the perimeter is broken down, as Chris said before, right? And you need the ability not only to protect, but you need the ability to identify when intruders come into your network or into your management plane or control plane, whatever you're trying to do, recognize what's happening, and to identify it and minimize the amount of time that they can do damage within those environments. And so there's been huge staffing increases, at least from my perspective, in those particular areas on the threat side of that risk equation. And as part of that, part of the planning that goes into that, I think from a law enforcement engagement perspective, from a governance perspective, it's really important for companies to reach out to law enforcement. And I know, for example, this works in both ways. So Michael Bobbitt with the Denver field office here at the FBI, right? He's reaching out to the ISA and ISACA groups to say, this is who I am, this is who we are. Reach out and have a personal relationship with them. Likewise for your legal department, right? It's very important that you have those lines of communication. If you're a large company, to reach out and actually talk through, for example, with the FBI, what your response might be if you had a major incident, what you want to go public with, what you don't want to go public with, and they will work with you on that to say, okay, we realize that you don't want your name in public, so we will not put your name in public if you have an event. And you can even, or an incident, and you can even have, an agreement pre-signed around that, around kind of the relationship there. So I think that's really important that people proactively, before a major event happens, that you think through that and you talk through it and you know the relationships and have those set up with law enforcement.
Thanks, Mike. Chris and I worked it out. He's going to go next, and then I'll go.
So kind of piggybacking off what Mike said, I mean, it kind of goes to what I was saying earlier as well, is that you have to have a robust incident response program in place because you assume at some level there's going to be incidents over time. And every large company like mine is going to face these challenges. So I think there's been a definite increase in the level of commitment to incident response. And I can talk a little bit more specifically about what AT&T does. And we have what we call the AT&T ACERT. It's an AT&T cybersecurity incident response team inside the company that's basically responsible for incident response. We have about, I don't remember the exact number, but somewhere upwards around 2,000 different cybersecurity professionals inside the business that are responsible for incident response and different elements of cybersecurity throughout the company, whether they're in our network operations team or on our security team itself. And a lot of their focus is in monitoring the network. So one of the things that we do is we have an entity up in New Jersey called AT&T GNOC, the Global Network Operations Center, ties into a bunch of other NOCs throughout the company, and we monitor the network 24/7. On average, we probably see somewhere upwards of 90 petabytes of data a day. Typically what they're looking for is different things like network anomalies. So we're looking for big spikes in traffic or changes in traffic patterns using net flow data that might signify a cyber attack. So an example I'll give you is that one of the examples I've used in presentations is that in 2009 when the president was inaugurated, we saw a huge spike in UDP traffic on the network. So it's an example of the kind of spike that we might see, right? So we go out and we try to look at it and say, what's causing a spike in UDP? Is it a cyber incident? Is it some other incident? Well, in that instance, it was because CNN was distributing video of the inauguration using UDP. But in other situations, we might actually see a cyber attack. Another example would be like the Super Bowl, right? So you just think about these different spikes in traffic, and then what our team does is they try to look at that and narrow it down and say, out of all this data that we're seeing, what is data that would narrow it down to a very specific, that would indicate a cyber threat, and then we have a forensics team that goes through and does forensics analysis and tries to determine what the threat is and identify malware signatures and that type of thing. So we have a fairly robust, we'd like to think anyway, incident response program inside the company today.
Hey, thanks, Chris. The FCC is a lot different than AT&T or Cable Labs. We do have a CISO and a CIO at the FCC to secure the FCC enterprise. I'm not either one of those people. Okay, I'm representing the policy side of the FCC, and our job, my job, and the job of the folks that are in the organization is to help assure that the communications sector and the providers that make up that sector are operating are providing assurance for reliability, resiliency, and security. That's what we do. Now, so we're not doing the same kinds of things that Chris and Mike described in my organization, but what we do get data. We get data about communications reliability. It's not the kind of data that's very well suited for measuring the health of the network from the point of view, from a cyber standpoint. It was just designed in an era where we weren't worried about things like that. That data is not where it needs to be just yet. All right, it helps. It can give us a signal that something's going on, but it's not what you would call a early warning or a cyber response system. We're doing another thing, which I mentioned earlier, and we expect to be starting relatively soon, is to have these assurance meetings with communications providers. But there again, that's information. It's not a cyber response capability, but it's information that will be useful for us to have in order to know if providers in the sector are taking measures to strengthen their cyber risk management systems and processes. So that will give us confidence and assurance that the right things are happening. That's not a risk management or a cyber response. It is a risk management, sorry. It's not a cyber response capability. So we've got some work to do, but we're moving, I think, in the right direction, and at least on the policy front. And I'm not speaking for the cyber, the enterprise now. So, Chris, I don't remember yet whether you've spoken to this. I think we've got about 10 minutes, right?
Yeah. Okay, so I'll just quick shout out then for as part of incident response. I think my colleagues talked about the need for specialized skills somewhere in there. There's that's a capability that not every organization can or has yet invested in. So I think that there's I think the earlier comment was talking about creating first responders or creating a skill, and I think that's probably there's going to have to be services organizations that can collaborate and kind of sweep up organizations that can't self-fund and self-organize the SOC and whatnot. So I think that's just one of the public issues that we're all going to have to wrestle with as an industry because of the specialization required.
Awesome. I'm going to go with the last question and then take some questions from the audience. Or do you want to just go right to the audience? Part of the objective of being here is to get feedback not only from the panel but from its audience. Or any questions from the audience?
Okay. This is a question for Jeff. My name is Ken Fellman. I do a lot of work with local governments. And you mentioned, I didn't catch the name of the committee that's making the recommendations, but you talked about the wide variety of recommendations for different sectors of the industry. Is that report also having a section on public safety communications and other state and local government communications that state and local governments and tribal governments might find useful? And if so, how are we going to be able to access that?
That report does not have a special section for, it had a lot of public safety and state and local entities on it, represented on the group. There's not a special section of that report. It's a public report, by the way, so you can get it, and if you give me your card, I can make sure you get it. Now, there's another group that was mentioned earlier called TFOPA, and that group might be more in line with what you're looking for. That group is coming up with recommendations specifically for the public safety community in this area, and that group has got a meeting coming up on Thursday, and I think there'll be further work being done there. So there again, that's a group that will have that report will be a public report, right, Dana?
That's correct.
Okay, so that information is public, and it's very focused on the public safety community. Okay.
I just wanted to add to that the person who's leading that from the FCC is Dana Zellman, who's holding the mic. I think if you take what TFOPA is producing out of its working group 1 and couple that with the CISRIC working group 4 product that was mentioned, specifically the small and medium business piece, I think you'll find a sweet spot that would be very useful for state and local governments. The small and medium business orientation in the TFOPA result, which is 911, but I think can be extended more broadly to public safety.
Any other questions? Oh, hey.
There's an optimization question here, I'm sure. Okay, no one? All right, that's fine. So my name is Alex Freiline. I'm with CU Boulder. So question about risk management frameworks, kind of specifically. I want to drill down into kind of some of the traditional best practices and see how some of you think that they may differentiate themselves under like a cybersecurity risk management framework as opposed to alternative risk management frameworks, right? So just to kind of head end it. So most risk management frameworks were born out of the nuclear regulatory industry or oil and natural gas, where threats were mostly unintentional and natural. They were physical threats, hurricanes, they're earthquakes. Whether we look in other areas of unintentional threats, that might be like fat-fingered errors, right? But here we have persistent actors who have complex motivations, who have multiple interests that are oftentimes competing or not aligned with, the kind of opportunities that telcos or other institutions might be trying to accomplish, right? So when you think about risk management, not incident response or forensics, but risk management specifically, how do you gain better tactical and operational intelligence on threat actors, as opposed to just quantifying that there are threats or having looked in databases of repositories and histories, as opposed to future-focusing threat intelligence analysis?
Sure, I guess I'll take that on to start. So, I think, first of all, I think you have to, from a communication perspective, industry perspective, you have to segment that and understand different areas of the network to begin with. So one area is the kind of the traditional enterprise network that you have. Kind of a second area would be your administration network that manages a lot of your service delivery networks, if you will. Sometimes those are combined. And then the third area is really around your service delivery networks and the type of traffic that goes across to your customers. So I think from an enterprise perspective, I think what I've seen work well in practice in different industries, outside of communications, is to have a very robust incident response plan where you're analyzing attacks that have gotten into your network. Very effective for example, the cyber kill chain that Lockheed Martin pulled together, allows you to see how far in within your network those attacks have made, and then you can analyze why didn't some of my security controls address those, and how did it get past it, or am I missing security controls within that? But then doing forensics work on those incidents, and then sharing that information out within a trusted closed group of partners, where you can correlate different incidents and what real threats are against your particular environment, right? Likewise, the threats that are targeting your enterprise will be different. There may be some overlap, but will be different from the attacks that you see on your carrier network, right? And the attacks that are targeting your customer base. And that's the reason why I like to segment those two, because if you try to say those same type of attacks and try to defend your enterprise from the attacks on your carrier network, you'll be wasting a lot of resources, because they aren't the same type of attacks. Likewise, within that environment, you can take the same approach.
So if I understand the question correctly, you're basically asking about how do we try to stay in front of these different types of attackers that are out there, because they are, they're not incented to follow the latest standards guidelines, right? I mean, they have the incentive to get around them, so they're intentionally trying to avoid that, which is, frankly, one of the reasons why I think the NIST framework, because it's risk management based, is better than standards, because standards, they're easy to sort of because you know what they are. It's published in a document. But I think that's a huge challenge for the entire cybersecurity industry, not just for carriers themselves. We focus on a lot of information sharing today, like Mike talked about in the industry, where we look for these traffic anomalies, we try to do forensics analysis, come up with signatures for malware, share that information within the industry. But frankly, staying out in front of the attackers has become a major issue, and I don't know there is an easy solution to that. I think one of the things that's being debated right now in Washington is this whole concept of how do we get to more of a real-time cyber defense mode using different types of standards, like the Sticks and Taxi standard that MITRE worked on with DHS, and for more real-time sharing of information so we can more quickly react and respond to threats. I think that's something that's being developed and that the industry is looking at doing to build on our existing capacity, but it's a big challenge. And frankly, in a lot of cases, you don't know that you're being hit with an attack until the incident actually happens. So that is a big challenge in cybersecurity, and I don't know if I have an easy answer for you, but I do think that the industry is trying to build out a lot of information sharing capabilities to try to shortcut that as much as we possibly can.
So let me throw one comment on top of that as well. In terms of information sharing, obviously that's the direction that the industry needs to go. But I think where we see a lot of investment capital going is towards predictive modeling, looking forward. I mentioned earlier that I have a background from Fair Isaac, which is of course all about predicting future behavior based on past data. I think in the security industry is struggling with that, quite honestly. It's like, how do we look at past performance, network anomalies, various technology signatures, and then correlate them to models and whatnot. I think that's probably the careers that we're preparing students for today, though, is the software-based, the software services and the network modeling services that are gonna kind of lead us towards prediction rather than response.
Any more questions? Yes, sir. We'll get it.
Kevin Rohr with the Commission on State Emergency Communications in Texas. Could the panel share their thoughts on how they feel the implementation of IPv6 will have on network security?
I'll pass on that one.
Yeah, I'm looking for an owner of the mic.
All right, I'll attempt to do that. So IPv6 is starting to be deployed widely, right? And when we started to deploy IPv6 initially in the early 2000s, what we found is there just wasn't the demand, to be perfectly frank, right? And then it kind of went away, and now with the resource exhaustion of addresses, it's back. What we see, and we have to be careful of, is we see some of the same problems that were solved under IPv4 coming back up under IPv6, right? We're trying to learn those lessons of not having to do that, but you see some of those issues coming up. And I think, over the next 5 to 10 years, you'll see some significant issues around that, right? You know, that we addressed in IPv4, but people forgot about, and then didn't address in IPv6 until the problem came back. So that's probably the biggest area that I think that'll have the impact on. You know, the whole transition between V4 and V6 will be interesting. But we have major, you know, we have some of our largest members implementing IPv6 at a very broad scale, right? And you know, so far that transition has been, in my opinion, very successful. You know, around that, the impact on public safety systems, I just think we have to stay very up to date on those particular issues and making sure that we don't forget the lessons we learned in IPv4.
Can you be specific about what those are technically?
Well, one that comes to mind is some, for example, that we dealt with was some source-based routing that was built into IPv6, and we had turned off. It was also baked into IPv4, and we had turned that off long ago, realizing just how bad of an idea that really was. But then we put it in IPv6 again, didn't turn it off by default. That would be an example of one of those things. But that was identified fairly quickly, right? And then the default configurations were turned off, as an example. I mean, you also have natting, things where natting goes away, right? And so you have exposure of elements from a NAT perspective in IPv4. And some people say, well, that's not really a security issue or a security feature. In my viewpoint, it is. I would call natting a security feature from IPv4 in the sense that it helps block some of the visibility into end devices that you may see disappearing into IPv6, and you have to address that, right? That's another issue where you now have the visibility of devices from a reconnaissance perspective for adversaries that maybe you didn't have in the past.
Just add that anytime you make a technology change as sweeping as what we're talking about with IPv6, these are the kinds of things that will come up. I haven't heard anything that I would consider to be, showstopper. These are things that need to be dealt with. I think that if the platform is introduced with robust cyber risk management of the kind that we've been talking about here today, the transition can go smoothly, right? But it's we've been through these kinds of things before, and maybe we could do it even better this time.
Yeah, I mean, I'll confess I'm not an IPv6 expert, but the people I've talked to about V6 security is that, typically speaking, they view V6 as actually enhancing the security and not actually taking away from it. And I think the idea of having each individual device being addressable is kind of cuts both ways, right? Because on one hand, you can NAT it, and you don't actually have visibility into the home. So like at my house, I might have 15 different devices connected to my Wi-Fi router, right? So if an ISP contacted me and said, hey, one of your devices has malware on it, I wouldn't know where to begin, right? Because they would just give me an IP address and it'd be like, okay, that's one of the 15, right? But if each device is individually addressable and somebody said, hey, IP address so and so and so and so is infected, I would know precisely which device it was, and so I'd have the ability to go in and make some corrections to it potentially. So I think it kind of cuts both ways when it comes to V6. I've always thought, I used to work very closely with our V6 program office, but we've always viewed it as basically a conservation tool because AT&T we're very big in the whole end-to-end IoT space, and so there's so many devices connected to the network. We need the V6 addressing. So the change is going to happen, but I actually think it's got some positive aspects for security in addition to other concerns that it might raise.
The awesome thing about being a moderator is I get that as the last word. We talked earlier in closing about risk assessments, and my philosophy is how you define success, and literally down to that detail in the DNA of not only product development, but in terms of process. And there is no one temple of security that we can go show up and be blessed. It's something you're going to have to do, and everybody's going to have to do every day in every level of service delivery, whether it be on the physical security side, the cybersecurity side, monitoring and business processes. So I think it was a great panel, and thank you all for coming. And